Ferrari is the strongest car marque out there, and many of their models are hugely collectible. But one group of 5 Ferraris have become collectible as a group, which is now widely known as the Big Five. Why is that? What are they? And not least, just how big are the Big Five? Well, pretty big, obviously. Which is why it was a pretty daunting task trying to cover them all in one video. In fact, it wouldn't be too difficult making a video about each and every single car in the group, but instead we're going to take a look at the wider picture, the concept of the Big Five. In order to understand that, we need to really dwell into the matter. So rest assured, this video is once again going to be about cars. Ferrari! First of all, the Big Five in this video are the GTO, the F40, the F50, the Enzo, and finally, LaFerrari. This is by far the most common interpretation of the concept of Ferrari's Big Five. Now, I mentioned them in the order in which they appeared on the world stage, beginning with the GTO of 1983, which of course makes a lot of sense, right? Sure it does. And therefore, let's start with the beginning. Problem is that the concept of the Big Five wasn't even an idea when the GTO appeared, as of course there was only this one car. Indeed, the term the Big Five did not appear until the 5th car had arrived on the scene, the LaFerrari that was unveiled in Geneva in 2013, almost 30 years after the GTO. And even then, the LaFerrari was not cast as the last member of this huge boy band called the Big Five. The thing is, the term is not something Ferrari invented. It's been a bit difficult trying to pinpoint exactly where in time and place it appeared first, but if you happen to know, please tell us in the comments below. The term itself is not new either. In fact, it is borrowed from the hunting world, where it signifies the 5 big game animals that were considered the most difficult to hunt. The lion, the leopard, the rhino, the elephant, and the African buffalo. Just a side note here. Just as there are in fact many more animals out on the savannah, there are also many more collectible Ferraris than the Big Five. Some of them even bigger than the Big Five. Just consider the almost sacred car that gave its name to the first of the Big Five, the original 250 GTO. Or the countless Formula 1 winners, or the Le Mans winners, or winners of Targa Florio and Mille Miglia. But then again, that might be a story for another time. This video is brought to you by Selected Car Investment, where we buy and sell only the best collectible cars. Check our website to see if your next car happens to be in stock, or contact us for off-market cars, or if you want help to find your next investment. I do think though that it was LaFerrari that opened the door for the term Big Five. Think about it. The name LaFerrari literally means the Ferrari, the one Ferrari. Mentioning one, it is obvious to compare it to a direct competitor, the McLaren P1, also of 2013. Now, P1 is a term from motorsport, meaning a car or driver starts the race from pole position, P1, which is also pretty definitive, isn't it? Because there can only be one in that position, right? Right, but there'll be another race next week at another track, or maybe even in another race series. So in reality, the moniker P1 is nowhere near as definitive as the term LaFerrari. And in fact, when Ferrari told the public about the new car back in 2013, one of my first thoughts were, how are they ever going to top that name? And today we know the answer. They did not. In that way, it did make sense that journalists, enthusiasts and car people thought that LaFerrari in some way concluded something. And then later came up with the concept of the Big Five. 5 really great Ferraris that together form a meaning of life, for a car guy at least. The thing is that even though these 5 cars are very different in look and feel and concept, they do have one very important thing in common. And in order to understand what that is, we do really need to go back to 1983 and a bit further to see what Ferrari was at that time. From the beginning of the GTO and even before, the rise of Ferrari was from the humble start in the 40s, based on a successful presence in motorsport. And as the Scarlet race cars triumphed from Mille Miglia over Le Mans to Grand Prix racing, their fame and reputation grew. In those early years, Ferrari generally took a shot at everything, and quite often with success. But the last Mille Miglia was run in 1957, and the last Le Mans victory was won in 1965. On a side note, there is a great Hollywood blockbuster movie about the following meager years in Le Mans and why that was. It is highly recommended for the entertainment value. The thing is that Ferrari had gradually shifted its focus to Grand Prix racing, which is now broadly known as Formula One, and with great success once again, which furthermore boosted Ferrari's image as the great racing and sports car producer of Italy. The 70s were great for Ferrari, scooping up 5 manufacturers' championships and 3 drivers' titles. In the same decade, they managed to renew their great road cars Daytona and Dino with the beautiful 1973 12-cylinder Berlinetta Boxer and the no less pretty 8-cylinder 308 from 1975. Add to the mix the elegant 365 GT4 and the quirky 308 GT4, and it seemed as though Ferrari had a complete product program and could do virtually nothing wrong. And Ferrari certainly ended the decade on a high, winning the 1979 Formula One championship with a naturally aspirated 12-cylinder car. However, at the time, the turbos were arriving in Formula One with a vengeance, and not least, they were joined by equally revolutionary steps within aerodynamics and chassis technology. Ferrari took the conservative approach and adapted only slowly. But in 1982 they were right up there, winning the championship of marques and only briefly missing the driver's title, a feat they replicated the following season. This was actually not bad by most standards, but Ferrari expected more. To add to the problems in Formula One, so did the road car customers. By the early 80s, the Mondial had joined the ranks, being much criticized for being too slow. And most of the 4-seater 400s were sold with automatic gearboxes. And even the top of the line Berlinetta Boxer had been strangled by emissions and lowered in power and performance, not to mention that it was a decade old. Ferrari were accused of going soft. All of that was the background, and now we're getting to the point. The GTO of 1983 was the response to just that. And it was a great answer, as this car was anything but soft. Incorporating 2 turbochargers, just like the Formula One cars, the race-derived V8 engine developed 400 horsepower and propelled this lightweight chassis to rather brutal performance figures, not least shining in a few months in the light of being the fastest series-produced car in the world. And it was pretty too. The overall design was clearly derived from the 308, but with much more muscle and curves, and it overall just worked. But what was the GTO? Well, you'll very often find the Ferrari GTO described as the Group B racing car that didn't race. Which is true. The GTO never did race in Group B. Could it have? Well, yes. But actually, it wouldn't have made much sense. When the motorsport authorities in 1982 debuted the Group A, standard cars made in more than 5,000 examples, the Group B, GT cars made in more than 200 examples, and the Group C, pure racing sports cars, it might have looked like an opportunity for Ferrari to develop a new car more along the lines of what actually made up their early success history. But truth is, the equally Italian marque of Lancia was part of the same industrial group under Fiat, and Lancia already had a promising Group B contender ready for the 1982 season, the Lancia Rally 037. As Lancia were also present in the Group C category with the LC2, a pure sports racing car that no Group B car could expect to beat, it would seem close to meaningless for Ferrari to develop the GTO for Group B. They would compete against their mother company Fiat, and they would lose. Nonetheless, in September of 1983, Enzo Ferrari himself announced that his factory would build the new car, and not least be naming it after one of their all-time greats, the 250 GTO from the 60s. Big shoes to fill indeed. For sure, Enzo Ferrari must have known at that time that the car would never race. Not least as it was still not even production ready, but in reality first shown publicly in Geneva in 1984. Amusingly, the GTO did eventually achieve homologation for motorsports in September of 1985. But by that time the goalpost had moved even further, and Lancia were winning in Group B with a four-wheel drive S4. So again, what was the Ferrari GTO exactly? Well, it was a supercar, quite simply. And it was a rare one too. Ferrari stuck to the story that they had to build 200 of them for homologation into Group B. But in the end they built around 270 of them, which altogether made it a supercar with a great story. And the GTO actually did beat many of the Group B competitors, namely when judged by their road car variants, in the looks and the power department, because the Ferrari GTO was far prettier than any Group B rally car, and better built, better appointed, and more powerful too. Between the lines, maybe revealing that the GTO was probably something more than a pure excuse for a road car. Could it be that the GTO was actually thought, developed and conceived as a road car? I firmly believe so, not least because this would explain how the GTO ended up as being a truly magnificent sports car for the road. True, it was not a perfect car, but few cars of the 80s were. Think about the GTO would be up against something like the Countach, the Porsche 911 Turbo, the Aston Martin Vantage, and very soon after the Porsche 959. Well, even the new Testarossa would probably have been seen as some sort of in-house competition. And anyway, all of the mentioned had their strengths and weaknesses, and so did the GTO. The important thing is that it was very true to its original brief of becoming a Ferrari that was not soft. It succeeded absolutely in this aspect, which is not to say that the GTO is a beast. It was in fact completely usable as a very fast road car as well. If anything, its successor, the F40, was more raw, but we'll get to that in a second. First, let us look at one very important aspect for any car manufacturer. Did the GTO sell? The answer is a bellowing yes. Ferrari claimed to have sold out the originally intended 200 cars very quickly, and as stated earlier, went on to build around 70 more. No wonder actually, as the price for a GTO was just around 30% more than for the Testarossa. Ah, the benefit of hindsight. Let's just say that Ferrari learned from that. So, let us conclude on the GTO. What makes it so special? Well, It has the hallmarks of a great Ferrari because of its performance, its great looks, and the fact that it marked a return to a more driver-focused Ferrari, expelling all accusations of softness. The GTO also connects the turbo technology of the Formula One cars of this time with the road cars, and it was supremely fast and, not least, a very sexy car to look at. But the really important thing about the GTO is that this is the car that marks the spot in time where Ferrari returned to building limited production sports cars instead of just building production sports cars. This one even with a great story of Group B racing attached to it. But in all essence, the true greatness of the GTO lies simply in the fact that it is the first halo car of Ferrari in modern times. More advanced, faster, more expensive, prettier, and in general just above the rest of the range. And another key aspect of the GTO, it was actually not available to everyone that wanted one. Now that is true exclusivity. I am actually not sure that all of this was fully appreciated at the time, as the number games were probably overshadowed by the fact that the GTO was just such a super cool car. But behind the scenes, Ferrari certainly learned from it. Which brings us conveniently to the next one, the F40. In some ways, the F40 is in fact the odd one out of these 5 cars. Originally, Ferrari announced they would be building only 400 of them, but we now know they went on and built 1,300 of them. In effect, making the F40 the only one of these 5 cars that is not limited production. More or less, Ferrari just sold as many as they could. And they did so at a price of more than 4 times that of the GTO. And I know that sounds completely unbelievable, but that is one important lesson that Ferrari learned from the GTO. The halo car can be much more expensive than the other cars in the range. And my personal theory is they could have asked for $100,000 more, because just look at it. Now, I'll gladly admit that the GTO is my personal favorite of the bunch, simply because it started them off. But the F40 is, in my opinion, let me know what you think, by far the best looking of the bunch. Or best looking. Maybe that's not the right term, is it? But then the F40 is just such an amazing shape that is so right in its balance between brutal and elegant that the world hadn't seen anything like it since the Countach, which was finally dethroned after years of being the favorite poster car on every teenager's bedroom wall. Pininfarina did a masterful job. And with the ultra-low nose and tall rear wing, the strong silhouette of the F40 remains one of the most recognizable, respected and plain well-loved supercar shapes even today. To think that the F40 is in essence just a further redevelopment of the GTO is another stroke of genius by Ferrari. While the basic architecture of the car remains true to the still turbocharged era of Formula One, the overall concept had changed in a very paradoxical way. That the F40, never intended for racing, is way racier looking than its predecessor with the claimed Group B intentions. The F40 literally looks like it belongs on the racetrack, where it did end up eventually, but that is somewhat another story, as the F40s in the Big Five collections of the world are usually the road cars, and are nonetheless for it. It is of course completely unnecessary telling you that the F40 is faster than the GTO. As I said, just look at it. Is there any car out there that is sexier looking than the F40? Please let me know what you think in the comments below. Which leads me to the F50. Oh, The F50. It was always going to be difficult following the F40, wasn't it? Sitting there in the Big Five collection, between the poster car F40 and the striking Enzo, which we'll come back to in a minute, one can almost ask the question, does it even belong here? The F40 was just so right, and the F50, in direct comparison, just so... The thing is that while one could say that the F40 was a quick and dirty rehash of the GTO, the F50 was anything but that. The F50 is simply a car that proves that beauty is not only skin deep. We should start with the engine, as with the F50, Ferrari returned to the V12 concept that made the company great in the first place. I think this is a detail that can barely be understated. As we've said before on this channel, and will undoubtedly do again, there simply is not a better layout for a piston combustion engine than the V12. And with the F50, Ferrari actually went one better. The story that the factory told was that the engine in the F50 was derived from the Formula One cars. But as Mercedes have rather recently learned in a very painful way, that is not something easily done. And true, Ferrari did modify the V12 to the point where not many, if any, parts are directly interchangeable, which in the end any owner would probably appreciate anyway, as the Formula One engine of that time had a lifespan of a few hours. Needless to say, the V12 of the F50 is a masterpiece of an engine, and maybe the most important part of the package. But it was also impressively well supported by Ferrari's first carbon fiber chassis, Formula One inspired suspension technology, and not least the very brave concept of bolting the engine directly to the chassis and the suspension directly to the engine. Pure motorsports. Add to that the aerodynamics, which according to Ferrari were more extensively wind tunnel honed than any Ferrari before it. And the end result was a car that was way better than the F40. And yet the F50 was not widely well received at the time, in the broad public anyway. It is one thing that the looks compared rather unfavorably with the F40, but quite another and more serious thing that the same sort of applied to the performance numbers. I say sort of because the F50 with 525 horsepower was more powerful than the F40, but it was also heavier and had less torque than the turbocharged V8s. Likewise, all the fancy aerodynamics were not aimed at optimizing top speed, but to improve stability and handling. So all the many improvements were not that apparent until you drove the car, and the problem is, not many did. Curiously, Ferrari were really not doing themselves any favors, as instead of getting the truth out via journalists test driving the F50, they actively limited the access to the car. In fact, just as they this time indeed did limit the production run itself. Just 349 cars were to be made, and they were even competitively priced. One has to remember the times, and actually 1995 was not a great time to be launching a new supercar for anybody. The thing is that the world economy was only slowly recovering from the early 90s crisis. And the funny thing is, yet many car manufacturers did launch new supercars. The booming years before had led many car makers into developing supercars, and they just happened to be launched these few years later into a failing economy. No doubt the limited number of F50s was a reflection of that too, but paradoxically, today it marks one of the F50's strong points as a collectible. It is actually the second rarest car of the Big Five. The F50's place in the Big Five history is based on more than rarity though. While the design is simply not in the league of the predecessors, technologically the F50 was much bolder, and not least the engine showed the formula for the coming greats. High revving, naturally aspirated engine not only made a lot of historical sense for Ferrari, but also added a musical drama to the driving experience that has by now become a trademark for Ferrari across the model range. This halo car opened that ball, and maybe indirectly another game too. The naming of these halo cars. While the F40 came out 40 years after the birth of the Ferrari marque in 1947, the F50 came out, well, 48 years later. Maybe this last anomaly led Ferrari to another learning. Naming should not be limited to chronological stories. Which brings us to the Enzo. Ah, cars with names! Don't you just love that? But before we continue this story time, I need to excuse myself and grab a cappuccino this time. Guys, would you be so kind to show the viewers some beauty shots of the Enzo while I grab some Italian caffeine? Ah, the Enzo. The Enzo. There is a lot to love about the Enzo, besides the fact that it was named after the founder of Ferrari. In short, the aggressive shape marked a return to form for Pininfarina. The new V12 was one of the best engines in the world. Technology pushed the boundaries further again, and the Enzo was markedly faster than its predecessor. Now, aggressive shape does not necessarily mean pretty, but one thing has characterized many Pininfarina designs over the years. They grow on you. They work with the times and sometimes make much better sense years after the first sketches. And I think the Enzo is one of those. The front of the Enzo was clearly inspired by the Formula One cars of the time. But back then I found it rather conceived or just plain strange actually. But now, many years later, when seen as a whole, the Enzo looks exactly like the Uber Ferrari of the time should. An intoxicating mix of spectacular road car with race car infused aerodynamics that just works as a whole. And importantly, does not look like anything else either, or sound like anything else. Which brings us to the V12 in this car. A hugely impressive piece of engineering and a very important engine for Ferrari. In fact, I feel almost sorry for it that it does not have an evocative name like Colombo or Lampredi, but was called the almost German-sounding F140B. While the F50 V12 might have roots in racing, the engine in the Enzo was a clean sheet of paper design, and it was both larger in displacement and had cleverer tech. This resulted not only in more power, but also in much more torque. and if anything, the bigger 6-liter engine was even more lively and more sprightly too. When the Enzo came out in 2002, its 660 horsepower engine was the most powerful naturally aspirated engine out there. A great achievement in itself. But even Ferrari could not have predicted how important this V12 was going to be for them. Being first shown in a true halo car like the Enzo is a great start for any engine, but it turned out to be only the beginning of the journey. By road car norms, the 660 horsepower from a 6-liter engine is pretty highly strung. But one of the greatest things about this engine is that it still had lots in reserve. As all the planned Enzo road cars were built, Ferrari launched its now famous FXX program, further developing the idea of limited production halo cars, somewhat out of a tangent, towards a racing-inspired theme and even lower production numbers. And in this guise, the F140 was tickled to develop more than 800 horsepower. Interestingly, it did also end up racing, as the Enzo's V12 and much else from it formed the basis for the Maserati MC12, itself a very exclusive and very collectible car. More importantly for Ferrari, though, was the V12's use in several other great road-going Ferraris, built in much larger numbers. So good was it, in fact, that we'll meet it again in the last of the Big Five. Enter LaFerrari, and let's just talk about that name for a moment. Of course, it's pure and proper Italian and literally means the Ferrari. Think about it for a moment. This was in 2013, and by that time Ferrari had built thousands and thousands of the greatest sports cars in the world. And yet, when this one came out, they called it the Ferrari? That name is just so definitive that it could have backfired terribly and ridiculed Ferrari for all the world to see. But it didn't. Quite the opposite. Many agreed at the time that LaFerrari was just that, the definitive Ferrari. When you consider for a moment that this was 10 years after the rather good Enzo, and that the goalposts had moved once again, that was actually quite an achievement. The Ferrari was not alone in this stratospheric market segment either, and it was part of the Big Three duel with the McLaren P1 and the Porsche 918, where it did well. And I choose those words carefully, as they in reality all did well. Those three were the greats of the new era of the hybrid supercar. And I think their battle more than anything show that cars of this magnitude are not only about numbers. So I won't go too deep into numbers. Yes, LaFerrari basically used a refined version of the terrific Enzo engine. And why shouldn't it use the best engine in the world? Those 800 horsepower were then supplemented by a hybrid drive inspired by Formula One tech to get close to, but not reach, there should always be something to strive for, 1,000 horsepower. But what really surprised everyone was the drivability of LaFerrari. The main contributor to that was probably the new dual clutch gearbox that finally coped very well with the slow driving you will inevitably encounter somewhere in the real world driving. And the damping, and the general comfort in the cabin, and the safety with which you could explore the immense performance capacity of the package. In pure accessible capability, LaFerrari towers over all the others here. Oh, and one more number. Ferrari would build 499 LaFerrari, which they did, and then 210 more with a detachable roof, the Aperta. Yes, they had learned something there too. And yes, it was faster than the Enzo. which means that this Ferrari is the fastest of the big five, without a doubt. It's much faster actually. It's much easier to explore for all people at all times. There are probably people out there who will say that LaFerrari is also the most beautiful of the big five, a meaning they are absolutely entitled to. I happen to disagree, so I'd like to hear what you think, as there is no doubt that beauty is very important, as is performance, as is technology. The Halo car in your model program needs to be the best you can do. That is literally what makes it. But best is not that easy to quantify, and these 5 cars illustrate exactly that. On their quest, Ferrari started out in 1983 by looking what was already on the shelves, including old model names, and created the GTO. Undoubtedly, that is the worst car here, but it happens to be my personal favorite. And only 30 years later did they, in the 5th iteration of the Halo car theme, arrive at a car so good they dared name it LaFerrari. Each of them are, of course, a great Ferrari in their own right. The newer ones are usually better than their predecessors, if for no other reason than that of time and technology moving on. In reality, you could say that they are just about equally collectible, equally lovable, and maybe equally drivable. But the thing is, together they form a story of the Ferrari Halo car. The car built in limited numbers, sold to a chosen few, not for everybody. And this story is culminating with LaFerrari in 2013. End of story. What can possibly come after that? Well, recently Ferrari launched their new Halo car, which name showed they sort of ran out of names. It's called the F80, although Ferrari is not yet 80 years old. Ferrari calls it the pinnacle of just about everything they can do. But it is half the cylinders of LaFerrari and a quarter of the symphonic engine note. Faster certainly, but definitely not prettier. Ferrari will be making 799 of them, so they will not be rarer either. But maybe it is better. And if so, does it then relegate LaFerrari to a Ferrari? Should we be talking about the Big Six? Or will it only happen in a few years' time, as with the F50 coming of age decades after its launch? I'm not sure. Those are seriously big questions about 5 great collectible cars. So if you happen to sit out there and have the answer, please leave it in the comments below. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it and would like to see more, please subscribe to our channel and like the video. And then we'll see you for the next one.